Continuing with the trauma, loss, enemy trope. Both TV documentaries lean heavily on this trope. American casualties are profoundly humanized. The terror experienced by the men of Charlie Company is attended to with careful minutes of emotional expression backed by soft, pensive music. Men speak quietly and slowly in tones of exceeding gravity. Again and again, readers and viewers and listeners are drawn to identify with the emotional reality experienced by the murderers. Next trope is Callie the villain. The spontaneous presence of widespread contempt for Lieutenant William Callie among the men of his platoon and others allowed caricatures of his appearance, intelligence, and character to emerge in testimony and expand in secondary sources. Callie, the stereotypical bloodthirsty pervert, stalking most tellings of the My Lai story, may resemble William Callie in some ways, but he is undoubtedly a fictional character on another level, with a strict narrative function. Along with the American heroes in our next trope, the image of Callie the villain bifurcates our assessments of and emotions toward the Americans. Since the differences between Callie and Hugh Thompson aren't easily reconciled, the two stay in eternal tension and effectively cancel one another out, leaving us with a sense of impotent neutrality toward U.S. soldiers as a group and toward making war by extension. Callie stood out to those around him. He was even singled out as a stone-cold killer in whistleblower Ron Ridenour's original letter to Nixon as Callie with a K. According to testimony from superiors and subordinates, Callie was a poor excuse for an officer with zero leadership ability. He fawned over Captain Medina, who only showed contempt in return. Callie appears most unsympathetic in the direct testimony of some of the most sympathetic troops. For example, Dennis Conti, who in his own testimony resisted orders to mow down villagers, though others report him killing civilians along with Paul Meadlow. Dennis Conti delivers an account to the Pierce Commission of the murder of a group of children by Callie in highly emotional terms. According to Conti, Callie looked like he was enjoying the killing. The extent to which this line was meant to be ironical is unclear, but taken at face value, it contributes to a growing caricature of Callie that persists to this day. Somehow Callie's superlative unsavoriness transforms him into a kind of moral sponge. He absorbs all the darkest evil of the episode into himself. In allowing themselves to hate Callie, American readers demonstrate their own morality and prove to themselves that censure is in fact landing somewhere in this mysterious mess. Callie the villain provides us with a place to put all our anger and disgust. American heroes is the next trope. The dedication to 1998's anthology Facing My Lai, edited by David L. Anderson, is emblematic of this trope. Quote, "This book is dedicated to Ron Ridenour and Hugh Thompson in recognition of their patriotism and common sense morality. And it is also dedicated, lest we forget, to the memory of the 504 Vietnamese who died in Son Mi village, My Lai 4 and Mi K 4, on March 16th, 1968. The emphasis there on patriotism was from me. Anderson draws explicit attention with that little added clause, lest we forget, to the fact that in this drama, the villagers of Son Mi are a readily forgettable element. Placeholders, mute sufferers. At their most sophisticated, these tropes use the limited subjectivity granted to Vietnamese victims and survivors as a scourge to lash the conscience of an America nevertheless redeemed in the end by the common sense morality of Thompson and Ridenour, handily presented in the same paragraph. Right, so putting these things near each other when they talk about them. Army veteran Ron Ridenour had a conscience. This is a big deal. It's such a big deal that every book, article, or chapter I found on the subject of My Lai uses some kind of angsty narrative of his expose of the atrocity, which took the form of a letter sent to his congressman Mo Udall and copied to the president and other officials. Every book uses this story to bookend or put My Lai in context. Often they waste no time. This is the first thing that you're learning about. It's this single act of decency, crucially, on the part of a military man, that ultimately reveals the truth to the American public. Never mind that Riddenhauer had personally witnessed murders of 2 or 3 civilians at a time without raising any objection at all, including on his very first mission in Vietnam. A tendency for storytellers to exaggerate the noble actions of helicopter pilot Major Hugh Thompson, especially, is muted but detectable. According to NPR, Thompson flew his helicopter down between fleeing villagers and advancing American soldiers and ordered his crew to shoot the Americans if they kept slaughtering innocent people. End quote. According to Thompson's testimony, however, that's not exactly how it happened. He ordered his gunners to protect him while he attempted to rescue civilians, and himself believed it wasn't feasible that Americans would fire on Americans. Just as Callie the villain first appeared as Callie with a K in Riddenhauer's original letter, another figure, this time of heroic resistance, also entered the story in that very first message to reach the public, and that is Michael Bernhardt. According to Riddenhauer, Bernhardt, or Bernie, had absolutely refused to take part in the massacre of the villagers. Examples of individuals who refused to kill, or at least claim to have refused to kill, provide a drop of redemption. In a story, a single drop can go pretty far because readers can pick and choose who to identify with. Everyone wants to be a Bernie. Nobody sees him or herself as a Callie with a K. An opera written about the massacre, centered entirely on Hugh Thompson's moral response to the killing, is described by LA Weekly Review as cathartic. Cathartic for whom, I wonder? In any case, this comment reveals the function of the trope, to provide redemption, healing, and a positive figure to identify with. It adds gratitude and admiration to the mix of emotions stirred up by the various elements of the story, most of which are horrible. We cling to the examples of Thompson, Riddenhauer, and Michael Bernhardt, whose refusal to participate in the killing caused other members of Charlie Company to distrust him, and his commanding officers to deliberately endanger his life. We cling to them like branches in a torrent, lest we be swept away by horror and madness. These hero figures help define the villains, both by contrast and with explicit testimony. It was Bernhardt, after all, who testified that Captain Medina was, quote, as much a nut as anybody else, and, quote, pissed off at people with, quote, no respect for the Vietnamese as human beings. In his comments from Facing My Lai, William Eckhart calls Thompson's behavior an example of something good on that awful day, and according to him, Ron Riddenhauer acts precisely as a citizen should. The fact that whistleblowers like Riddenhauer and Thompson were themselves military men is always treated as significant. Military values are cited as the reason for the expose, whereas the massacre itself is seen not as an expression of militarism or military culture, but rather as a sign of its breakdown. The presence of identifiable American heroes in the My Lai story functions to provide comfort, catharsis, relief, and a moral center, whatever that means, to the American public. Next trope is moral mystery. Often a reader's first introduction to the My Lai story is as a baffling, almost absurd, and incomprehensible moral mystery. The earliest article I could find on the massacre outside of the newspapers was one by an unnamed staff writer in Science News from December of 1969, entitled Analyzing the Inexplicable. Right from the start, the issue is framed as superlatively befuddling. The question is always an almost desperate one. How can we explain this? Or more accurately, how can we explain this away? 3 minutes and 20 seconds into the American Experience documentary My Lai, directed by Barack Goodman, the massacre is referred to as an event which nobody would want to believe. Contemporary military commentators are baffled. The explanations of philosophers ultimately fail to allow understanding, while our attempts to comprehend the evil are defied. Often found in titles, such as the intro to Facing My Lai, called What Really Happened, the moral mystery trope implies obscured meanings. The moral mystery trope implies obscured meanings. This explicit or implicit mystification, used so often in titles, casts the shadow of this trope over everything that follows. The subtitle of the same book, Facing My Lai, is Moving Beyond the Massacre. This reveals the motivation powering this trope, namely, to get through and leave behind this ugly, damning event, with or without a significant reckoning. The book is a compilation of essays, many of which are very critical of the perpetrators of the massacre, or of American policy in Vietnam broadly, but using all of the tropes I've outlined in various forms and combinations, which weakens and undermines any demand for accountability. And of course, none of the essays takes aim at war itself as the circumstance clearing the path for atrocity. The common claim in so many tellings of the My Lai story that the reality of My Lai will forever elude us is an inane platitude that functions to lull readers into a state of moral befuddlement, and yet some form of it is used, even by writers specifically addressing ethics, to punch up their prose style. Okay, on to tellings. When the story first broke in 1969, the first priority for some Americans was to explain how our boys could have done such a thing. Right from the start, the murders, rapes, and mutilations in the attacked hamlets were treated as an inexplicable aberration, something extraordinary, even in war, something unthinkable. Efforts were made immediately to explain the massacre as though the single word war wasn't enough of an explanation. This focus on explanation emerges clearly as the central task of public discussion on the subject of the massacre. Every retelling of the events acquires another layer of pathos and mystification as the musings and speculations do the work of humanizing the killers by magnifying their subjective experience in a dramatic narrative. In contrast to the victims, who can only suffer and be horrified, humiliated, or hurt, we are carefully made familiar with a story the soldiers of Charlie Company might have been telling themselves while killing. Every telling focuses on the subjective experience of the Americans. Every telling involves explanations. Every time the story is told, you will hear about the dirty tactics of the VC, the pain suffered by Charlie Company, their poor leadership and poor training. You'll also hear about the mute, mindless suffering experienced by the Vietnamese. At its most sophisticated and effective, this last element will come in the form of a videotaped testimonial, backed by mournful music. The testimonies of surviving villagers have the potential. These testimonies of surviving villagers do have the potential to refocus our attention. Fittingly, in spite of the accretion of exculpatory noise and narrative all around the My Lai massacre, survivor testimonials reinforce the sense that the experiences of the villagers are the point, the locus of meaning in the whole story. Not the frustration of the soldiers, not the quality of their basic training. The human center of this story must be the abrupt and brutal atrocity as experienced by its victims, and as experienced also in a world historical sense, by observers, by people who hear the story. The agenda must be human and not American, not martial. Such a dramatic story can be told as an isolated illustration to support many agendas. According to Roberts and Olson's overview and introduction to the story, for anti-war activists, according to Roberts and Olson's overview of an introduction to the story, the agenda sentences that we wrote. According to Roberts and Olson's overview of an introduction to the story, for anti-war activists, the massacre is evidence of the evil of the war in Vietnam. For military spokesmen, it is evidence of an isolated incident of misconduct by flawed individuals. This is the weakest section. Sorry, I shouldn't be doing this. Okay. For military spokesmen, it is evidence of an isolated incident of misconduct by flawed individuals. For the American public at large, the lesson is that the war in Vietnam is somehow special in a way that absolves Charlie Company, even Lieutenant Calley, and by extension the entire American military project of guilt. For most Americans, according to Roberts and Olson, the blame rested amorphously on in Washington, D.C. For most Americans, according to Robertson Olson, the blame rested amorphously in Washington, D.C., a faceless, ever-changing, essentially unassailable target. I'd argue that, in fact, the purpose of the narrative that emerges from the various military sources is to confuse. Okay, I'd argue that, in fact, the purpose of the narrative that emerges from military sources is to confuse, diffuse, and disperse anger and horror in such a way as to make accountability impossible to achieve. Folks come away feeling unsettled, but basically paralyzed. The monstrosity of the facts is huge, but so much more time and space on the page is given to the excuses and feelings of the perpetrators that a kind of moral paralysis descends on the reader. The authors conclude by throwing up their hands and declaring the whole thing a mystery. The opera My Lai, composed by Jonathan Berger, is a bizarre and grotesque element of the My Lai corpus. Subtitled A Monodrama for Tenor, String Quartet, and Vietnamese Instruments, and featuring Hugh Thompson as the only character, the entire event is reduced to the voice of the single most sympathetic American character. Our protagonist is the pilot of an armed helicopter that had killed civilians before, but somehow he represents some kind of redeeming decency in the American military. This is grim and absurd in my view. While I find the opera My Lai grotesque and unheimlich, I do believe artists have some ability to tell the story in a more legitimate way. One simple example of a work of art being used without indulging in catharsis is the poster Q and Babies, A and Babies, by the Art Workers Coalition in 1970. It just shows a pile of corpses with the text of the title superimposed in large red letters. There's nothing cathartic to grasp in this image. In this way, it provides a more accurate understanding of the unsettled horror that results from war. I'd argue, even when I agree with the historian or writer's point regarding the massacre at Sơn Mỹ, that the mere use of these tropes reifies an understanding of the My Lai massacre that functions to protect the institution of war. That's right, sister. I went there. The practical function of a story. A friend once told me a story about sharing the surveillance video of a knife attack with several acquaintances. He asked them, "What would you do in this situation?" Most responded with various strategies for blocking or fleeing the attacker, but one man said, "Well, I probably would have stabbed the guy more in the neck than in the body." Probably the most important factor in our analysis of a story's importance or meaning is the matter of which figures in the narrative we identify with. While the tropes that emerge within the popular narrative of the My Lai massacre do encourage readers to identify with the soldiers doing the killing rather than the villagers being killed, they did not function to absolve the men involved. Absolution isn't the point. We're meant to condemn the men of Charlie Company as individuals and as a group. Directing that condemnation at the men, at their particular officers and leaders, at their particular training regimen, etc., is meant to pacify calls for broader changes. The tropes function to absolve war itself, to rehabilitate war in the minds of an increasingly horrified contemporary American population. Exculpatory tropes work independently, but they also fall into categories and complement each other. The bad sports trope and the trauma loss trope are often deployed together. They're not identical, however, just complementary. Of course, it's even more frustrating when one's traumatic losses are caused by a nefarious enemy who doesn't play by the rules. Of course, bad leadership plays a role in developing enemy. Grief involves anger, bad sports make us furious. Used in combination to form a plotted narrative, these tropes are especially powerful. They lead us like breadcrumbs to a kind of confusion about agency and war, a queer paralysis tainted by disgust. Each trope is presented along with an implied or explicitly referenced, but often still vaguely described, fix. That is, if poor training caused the massacre, then we can institute better training protocols. Or if poor leadership caused the massacre, then we can choose better leaders. If trauma and grief are what caused the massacre, or if the bad sportsmanship of traps and snipers caused the massacre, then no fix is needed or possible because maybe the whole thing was understandable. If one thing is consistent in most popular and many scholarly tellings of the My Lai story, It is the effort to make the feelings and choices of the men who murdered over 500 people more understandable. In my view, a story like this should not provide any avenues for catharsis. I think the discomfort and tension it produces should remain unresolved in order to preserve a more accurate understanding of what happened. There should be no relief provided by the heroism of Thompson, no escape into demonizing Lieutenant Calley, no muted admiration for the candor of the perpetrators or their varied performances of shame and regret, no dizzy shrug at the complexity of it all, no wonkish focus on minute tweaks to military policy that might shift the likelihood of atrocity down a degree. The My Lai story is just another illustration of the illegitimacy of war. Some conclusions, alternative interpretations, and interventions. So, to preserve war, these tropes are deployed, not to absolve the men who we are still meant to despise for their failure to act as responsible moral agents. No, the men remain villains. The thing these tropes seek to rehabilitate is the American military project itself, our beloved local war machine with all its stakeholders. If we could just train the men better, or send robots instead, then we wouldn't ever again have to bear the psychic pain of terrible, shrieking guilt at our own choices. I did find tellings of the My Lai story that I thought were measured and effective without indulgence in the exculpatory tropes I've identified. An entry in the Encyclopedia of Media and Propaganda in Wartime America, edited by Clarence R. Wheator, reads, without pathos, for example, March 16th, quote, March 16th, 1968. Troops from the American Division rape, torture, and murder more than 500 Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. Combat photographer Ron Haverly documents the slaughter, but it will be more than a year before the Army cover-up of the massacre is broken. Investigative report of Seymour Hirsch hears that platoon commander Lieutenant William Calley has been charged with murder and is awaiting trial at Fort Benning, Georgia. After interviewing Calley and others involved in the massacre, Hirsch writes his stories but cannot convince mainstream news outlets to touch the story. On November 12, 1969, the Dispatch News Service, an alternative news organization based in California, reports Hirsch's story. 8 days later, establishment news organizations such as Time, Newsweek, and CBS pick up the story. End quote. I appreciate the matter-of-factness of style in this entry and see such a style choice as one way to counter the effect of explaining, which veers so consistently into excusing. Oh, I lost my place. That's no bueno. Where are we? Yes, I appreciate that style choice, and I see it as one way to counter the effect of explaining, which veers so consistently into excusing. More academic sources in general rely less on tropes or stylistic storytelling, which mutes the interference of emotional identification. My argument is that none of the excuses, alone or in combination, actually explain the massacres at My Lai, but that one word, war, does. We need to escape our tropes to gain a clearer understanding. The way we tell this story tragically misses the point in pursuit of a kind of misleading thoroughness. We want to account for events historically, by understanding the underlying causes of human actions. It is possible to become too focused on the internal experiences of actors with whom we share an idiom. This is certainly the case in how we discuss the My Lai massacre. It is possible to become too focused on the internal experiences of actors with whom we share an idiom. These narratives are so saturated with the thoughts, feelings, needs, and prerogatives of Americans that they crowd out, among other things, the experiences of the Vietnamese victims and survivors. What is accountability? Should the members of Charlie Company who killed civilians go mad, die, suffer bad luck, go to prison, face the survivors of their actions, face them disarmed and willing to be killed in retaliation? Yes, maybe that. Maybe that would redeem something. I'm furious at these men partly because it is safe for me to be furious at them. They are out of my reach, so why should I waste time on excuses for them? The argument that occurs to me is that there are lessons to be learned in the way we train the men for war, the way we led them in war, lessons about how we might do things differently, but the only important lesson really is the one of the massacre itself. We should not be killing one another. There should be no war. Even while using the familiar exculpatory tropes to do narrative heavy lifting, many of the historians addressing My Lai have aimed to explode their implications. 2 examples in particular inform and complement any recommendations I have. Both of them managed to damage the efficacy of the tropes by addressing the My Lai massacre as part of broader examinations. Scholar Lawrence Rockwood deals with military ethics and command responsibility in his book Walking Away from Nuremberg. Where addressing My Lai is instructive for his purposes, he's also able to bring to bear a set of perspectives and sources much wider and deeper than those of a project confined to direct primary sources. Rockwood also does legwork. Traveling to Vietnam to interview present-day officials in Son Mi village, Rockwood discusses the local memory of the massacre. He begins his chapter titled Command Responsibility in the My Lai Massacre this way, placing the narrative locus with the survivors and neighbors of the murdered. Later, in comparing combat conditions in Vietnam with those of the Second World War, from expert perspectives, Rockwood tortures the notion that warfare in Vietnam was special in a way that made atrocity more likely. He's able to do this because his purpose isn't telling the story of My Lai. His purpose is understanding the decay of military ethics and accountability after Nuremberg. This may be a clue to how My Lai should be handled by historians seeking to communicate. Perhaps some stories shouldn't be told only for their own sakes. Perhaps certain historical sites should only be used as examples to the extent that they help make a larger point. Another good example of the My Lai story being used effectively as part of a general critique of Vietnam that doesn't indulge in cathartic or exculpatory tropes, this time in a popular magazine, is Nathan J. Robinson's piece in Current Affairs entitled What We Did. Robinson spares no sympathy for the perpetrators of atrocity and brings his readers' attention back again and again to the Vietnamese people who were killed so cruelly. Because, aside from those two and other exceptions, the discourse is so focused on the experiences and reactions of Americans, it allows for a dissipation or stymieing of accountability. Present-day narratives about war lack the critical edge of the immediate post-Vietnam discourse. Hold on, give me a sec here. Blocking. Okay, this mellowing of critique comes from the focus put on the horrifying experiences of our boys. They are the squeaky wheel getting all our grease. Policy was instituted to address the concerns raised by stories told about Vietnam, to minimize the trauma and horror experienced by the American public at large by switching to an all-volunteer professional army drawn from the lower classes, and by expanding the use of pilotless robot drones and private contractors. We put war at an emotionally tolerable distance because our stories about the war spent so much time on those aspects, on those emotionally intolerable aspects of combat. Imagine if 90% of the discourse around the Nazi Holocaust was focused on the experiences of Germans and the reasons they became Nazis and committed atrocities. In this hypothetical scenario, about 10% of the word count is still devoted to the murders of 11 million people, but the bulk of the material deals with the emotional motivations of individual Nazis. But imagine the bulk of the material deals with the emotional motivations of individual Nazis. We'd certainly have a very different understanding of the Nazi phenomenon. Of course, some of the discourse around Nazism is and should be about the historical, economic, and social reasons individuals participated in atrocities. But in the case of Vietnam, and of My Lai in particular, all we ever seem to talk about are the excuses these men gave. Whether or not we accept the excuses, often we don't. Callie the villain is despised in all accounts. They take up all the space on the page and thwart our attempts at understanding the events of March 16, 1968 in a broad global historical context. Choices are being made when historians draw from an archive of primary sources. If all of our sources are from within a single institution, we must take extra care that our conclusions aren't unduly narrow or distorted considering the missing perspectives. There are many answers in General Peer's report to the kinds of questions a military man might ask about what happened in My Lai, but very few answers for the Son Mi grandmothers who died in ditches. or the man who survived as a child by hiding under the bleeding corpses of his family. Since this is the case, we must intentionally and transparently curtail our airing of every minute psychological detail in our archive that might familiarize or rationalize the choices of killers, merely because we share their idiom. Weighting our history so heavily with potent emotional content from representatives of a single institution is irresponsible. It distorts rather than clarifies the meaning of an event like the murders at Sơn Mỹ. When we search through our primary source options, we might have to creatively make use of negative space, or leave out what we might instinctively feel like relevant information, if including it has a distorting effect on our moral understanding of what happened that day. The end.